In the early 17th century, Europe was awash with ambition, exploration, and commerce. Empires sought spice, silk, gold, and dominion. But one venture would do more than merely trade. It would forge a new model of power, combining business, war, and empire under a single corporate flag. That venture was the Verenigde Oost-Indische Company, in English, the Dutch East India Company, or VOC. More than a trading company, the VOC wielded powers no other private enterprise ever had. It could make treaties, legally raise armies, execute criminals, and govern lands. It was the first joint stock company, the first multinational, and the first to issue shares to the public. Its legacy is woven deep into the architecture of global capitalism, and its shadows still linger. This is the story of how the VOC soared to unimaginable heights, wealth beyond any empire, influence beyond the king's crown, and how it finally tumbled under its own weight, leaving behind a legacy that still echoes in our global economy. From wood-hulled ships setting sail into unknown waters to colonial capitals carved from spice islands, from dividend payments in Amsterdam boardrooms to brutal conquests in the East Indies. This is the saga of commerce as empire, profit as power, and collapse as consequence. Before we begin, like, share, and subscribe to this channel. By the late 1500s, Dutch merchants had begun pushing east, competing with Portuguese and Spanish fleets in Asia's spice routes. But rivalry at home meant cutthroat competition and frequent losses. To bring unity and state backing, the States General of the Dutch Republic consolidated the competing merchant houses into one entity. On March 20, 1602, the VOC was formally chartered. It was granted a 21-year monopoly on Dutch trade with Asia and the authority to act with quasi-sovereign powers. To wage war, negotiate treaties, maintain an army, and colonize. The idea was radical. Private citizens could invest in voyages, own shares, and trade them in secondary markets, giving rise to one of the world's first stock markets. Each VOC chamber, in Amsterdam, Zeeland, etc., contributed vessels and capital to the combined enterprise. The board, known as Heren 17, Lord 17, oversaw global operations. Thus began a project unlike any before, a corporation with the tools of sovereignty. From its Dutch base, the VOC pushed into Asia, establishing trading posts in Banten, Java, Surat, India, Malacca, Colombo, Sri Lanka, and more. In 1603, the VOC founded its first permanent trade post in Banten, Java. By 1611, it had established operations in Jayakarta, later Batavia. In 1619, under Governor-General Jan Pieterszoon Cohen, VOC forces seized Jayakarta, then part of the Banten Sultanate, and renamed it Batavia, using it as a central hub for their Asian operations. The capture was forceful. Cohen led about 19 ships and several hundred troops in a campaign, defeating local resistance. Batavia soon became headquarters for administration and trade. Meanwhile, in the Banda Islands, the Nutmeg and Mace Islands, the VOC imposed harsh monopoly control. It expelled or exterminated most of the indigenous population to ensure control of spice production. The VOC's reach extended to India, Coromandel, Malabar coasts, Ceylon, Sri Lanka, coastal China, Formosa, and the Malay archipelago. Their fleet was substantial. At its height, the VOC maintained around 150 merchant ships and 40 warships, and employed tens of thousands. In trade volume, the VOC dwarfed British competitors in Asia. From 1602 to 1796, VOC ships transported nearly 1 million Europeans to Asia, moving over 2.5 million tons of cargo in goods and slaves. Because supply of European goods in Asia was limited, VOC often traded silver and gold for spices, silk, porcelain, and other valuables. Thus, the VOC connected Europe and Asia in a web of finance, trade, and dominance. What made the VOC truly unique was its blend of business and sovereignty. It could mint its own coins, strike treaties, raise military forces, and execute justice in its territories. It operated as a state within a state. In Java, many territories were under VOC control rather than Dutch state control. In Asia, VOC officials often adopted dual roles: merchant administrators and regional governors. Local leaders were sometimes coerced or bought into alliances. The financial innovations of VOC were pathbreaking. Permanent shares, Unlike earlier ventures that financed one voyage at a time, the VOC issued shares that persisted across voyages. Secondary markets. Shares were traded in open-air markets in Amsterdam, giving liquidity to investors. Limited liability. Investors' losses were capped at their investment. They were not personally liable beyond their stake. Dividend policy. In prosperous years, VOC paid dividends as high as 18%. The VOC's model became a prototype for all future multinational corporations and financial empires. But behind the veneer of trade lay violence and exploitation. The VOC exercised monopoly control brutally. Local farmers were forced to plant spices at quotas. Resistors were punished, lands confiscated, populations displaced. One notorious incident was the Amboina Massacre, 1623. VOC officials arrested English East India Company employees, along with others, on suspicion of conspiracy, tortured them, and executed them to secure spice dominance. In 1740, in Batavia, a massacre of ethnic Chinese residents occurred during a period of famine and unrest. Estimates of the death toll range from 5,000 to over 10,000. The VOC also used punitive expeditions. For example, in Taiwan, then Formosa, after shipwreck disputes in 1636, many inhabitants were killed or deported. The treatment of indigenous populations in the Spice Islands, especially the Banda Islands, was horrifying. Starvation, forced labor, and massacres. The VOC essentially attempted to wipe out populations to consolidate its spice monopoly. Such brutality was not an aberration but structural. Violence was a tool of monopoly control. The VOC's golden age spanned roughly 1630 to 1670. During this time, profits and influence peaked. But by the late 17th and early 18th centuries, signs of strain emerged. The silk trade from Japan declined due to Japanese restrictions on metal exports, limiting VOC leverage. The loss of Formosa to Koxinga in 1662 removed a key Asian foothold. Wars in Europe, e.g. Anglo-Dutch conflicts, disrupted trade and caused fleet losses. Internal mismanagement, corruption, and the burden of maintaining militaries and distant colonies drained finances. The VOC often distributed dividends larger than its actual net profits, borrowing to maintain appearances. From about 1730 to 1780, the VOC's decay accelerated. Its intra-Asian trade shrank. Administrative centralization in Batavia became inefficient for growing operations. The Fourth Anglo-Dutch War was especially damaging. The VOC lost ships, trade routes disrupted, finances bled. By the late 1790s, the VOC was bankrupt. In 1796–99, its debts and assets were absorbed by the Dutch government. On December 31, 1799, it was formally dissolved. The Dutch state took control of its colonies, including Java, Ceylon, and the Spice Islands, which later became the Dutch East Indies. Thus ended the first global corporate empire. Though the VOC ceased to exist over 2 centuries ago, its legacy endures. Its innovations laid the foundations for modern capitalism. Joint stock companies, stock exchanges, limited liability, corporate governance, global trade networks. The VOC archives survive. Dutch archives hold over 25 million pages of documents from its operations. The colonial structures VOC built turned into the Dutch colonial state, which would control Indonesia, then Dutch East Indies, until the mid-20th century. But also, the VOC's legacy is a caution. Economic dominance, when fused with political and military control, breeds exploitation and injustice. Modern global corporations that operate across borders, evading regulation, extracting resources. Some scholars compare them to a neo-VOC model. In Indonesia and parts of Southeast Asia, cultural memory still holds trauma from VOC rule. Land dispossession, forced cultivation, and inequities rooted in colonial extraction. As we consider today's tech giants, multinational mining firms, or sovereign wealth funds, the VOC offers a mirror. How much power do we vest in corporations? And who checks them? One dramatic episode that captures VOC's dark depths is the story of the ship Batavia, 1628. Built in Amsterdam, the Batavia sailed in 1629 to the Indies. She wrecked on the Houtman-Abrolhos reefs off Western Australia. Most survivors reached nearby islands, but a senior VOC official, Geronimus Cornelis, plotted mutiny and massacres. Over weeks, Cornelis' group murdered more than 100 survivors, including women and children. Only a remnant group resisted, waited for a rescue party, and exposed the atrocity. It became one of the darkest chapters in VOC lore. This incident illustrates how, even in corporate expeditions, power can corrupt absolutely, when authority is unchecked and human life is devalued. The Dutch East India Company was not just a merchant fleet or trading house. It was a blueprint for corporate sovereignty, a first in history. It changed how we think about capital, state, and empire. It brought phenomenal wealth to some, and untold suffering to many. But its echoes still resonate today, in boardrooms, tax havens, corporate rule, and global inequality. The VOC's empire did not end in battle. It crumbled with ledgers, debt, corruption, and mismanagement. The great ships sailed no more, the spice monopoly evaporated, and in 1799 the company was formally dissolved, its assets taken over by the Dutch state. Yet out of its fall rose an even more profound legacy. The corporations of today, stock markets, global supply chains, joint stock ownership, all grew from seeds sown by the VOC. In the end, the tale of the VOC is a cautionary epic, of how private enterprise can wield state-like power, how profit can drive conquest, and how even the mightiest commercial empire can collapse when the unaccountable meets the unsustainable. If you believe that the legacy of the first global corporation still shapes our world today, then this story reminds us, power may be built in boardrooms and trading houses just as much as in palaces and armies. Because the VOC may be gone, but its blueprint still governs how we trade, invest, and expand across nations. And that makes its rise, domination, and decline far more relevant than ever. If this story gave you deeper insight into how corporations became empires, like, share, and subscribe. Let more people know that what seems new often has ancient roots. Because the story of the VOC is not just history, it's a lesson for our present.